it is my distinct pleasure and honor to introduce you to one of the top scholars in entrepreneurship research, someone whose papers I was reading as a PhD student and who continues to be prolific scholar, Dr. Tom Lumpkin. He is Professor Emeritus at Price College of Business, University of Oklahoma, visiting Senior Research Associate at Haslam College of Business, University of Tennessee. He has a PhD from University of Texas at Arlington, and his research focuses on corporate entrepreneurship, social entrepreneurship, and as you saw in the 4 papers you read for today, he has an impressive breadth of research in entrepreneurship research. There was no way I could do justice to all the awards and honors he has won in entrepreneurship research, so I am just going to say that he's the author, co-author of several award-winning papers, including Foundational Paper Award in the entrepreneurship, from the entrepreneurship division. Again, he's published in so many journals, there was no way I could have a whole list of journals, but he's published in almost every top journal that publishes entrepreneurship research. So with that, Tom, thank you very much for being willing to talk to our participants today.
Well, thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here. It's great to see you, all of you. I think this is the beginning of your event, and so it's good to be part of that. I'm just going to jump right in. I have slides and you know, the assignment that I have that was Professor Gupta gave me to share, and so here we go. Let me put on my slides and make sure they're working. So can you see those?
Not yet.
Yeah, no, I know. Yep, I understand. I've got to share screen. Here we go. How about that? Can you see that? Can you see them now?
Yeah, we can.
So I'm clicking on. There we go. Did that go full screen? It looks like it.
Yes.
Okay. So thank you again for this opportunity. Let me just share what is sort of an outline of what I'm going to talk about here today. Some of my own research interests, my path to getting here, and as Vishal said, a few tips for students to the extent that I have some. So I'm going to focus really on my current research interests, but also use that as a way to talk about the things that I have studied up until now. So in terms of constructs, entrepreneurial orientation, civic wealth creation, and long-term orientation are still the focus of my research. When people ask me what I'm working on, these are the 3 things that I mention. My kind of domain focus really, though, is social entrepreneurship. And interestingly, in terms of context, my context more are small and medium enterprises, family enterprises, and community enterprises. And let me sort of start there as a way to, you know, share a little bit of my background. When I entered the PhD program, I had about a dozen years of experience. So I was in my mid-30s. I was, so 12, 13 years since I'd gotten my MBA. And I went in and I said, I want to study small business. And they were like, well, it was a strategy faculty. And they, you know, they said, well, you know, I don't know about small business, but maybe entrepreneurship would be of interest. And so I started looking into that. Entrepreneurial orientation has its roots in the strategy literature, in the strategy making process literature. And so part of the reason I got focused on entrepreneurial orientation early in my career was because the faculty that I was working with were strategy faculty. It's also interesting, as Vishal said, entrepreneurial orientation is typically linked to corporate entrepreneurship. But that was not my experience. I'd never worked for a major corporation, and I was more interested in small business. But it's a construct that came out of corporate entrepreneurship research, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a few minutes. But it sort of leads me to one of my first tips here, and that is that the entrepreneurship, as I see it, is really the only discipline in the business school that deals with the pre-organizational period of a business. Accounting, finance, they're almost all dealing with existing businesses. But entrepreneurship is unique in that it talks about the time before there is an organization. And in my view, except for the opportunity research, and there's been a lot of that, that's an under-researched area. That is what goes on in the period prior to the forming of an organization. And I think that that's something to keep in mind. And that opportunity, in my view, includes entrepreneurial orientation. Again, something I'll say more about in a little bit. So in terms of my research itself, why won't the slide advance? This was the article that sort of got me started. Actually, this was based on my dissertation research. It's an AMR, it's a conceptual paper, but I started working on this as a doctoral student, and I have been working on it throughout my career. I did 7 editions of a strategic management textbook with Greg Dess. And my main contribution to the textbook was to write about entrepreneurship and entrepreneurship as a strategy topic. Now, I'm much more of just a entrepreneurship stands alone and doesn't need strategy kind of guy these days. But that's where I got started. And I think it's also fair to say that this article, which was kind of my COVID project, you'll notice it's like a 50-word, 51-page book chapter, was intended in part to sort of, address some of the topics that came up since I had written this article in 1996, and to maybe make a few correcting statements, put out my own ideas about where this notion of entrepreneurial orientation has gone, and how the field has developed. But the point is, I'm still working on this, both at the very beginning and sort of the very end of my career. This chapter appeared in a volume where your own Joshua White and Professor Gupta also have book chapters on the topic of entrepreneurial orientation. I did not really plan to talk about what entrepreneurial orientation consists of. I can do that if you like. But one of the things that happened in the 96 article was that I suggested that perhaps the 3 dimensions that are associated with it, proactiveness, risk-taking, and innovativeness, were not enough to sort of cover the topic completely, and come into 2 more. Autonomy and competitive aggressiveness. Well, one of the things I do in this paper is I make an argument for why we should be using the term competitiveness rather than competitive aggressiveness. So we can talk about that more in the Q&A, but just to keep moving, then this paper, which is one of the ones that you were assigned for today, has actually become like my 3rd most cited paper. It is a meta-analysis which says, in essence, that what these guys, Lumpkin and Kogan and other people, have been talking about entrepreneurial orientation for some time, namely that it is positively associated with performance, that it makes firms stronger performers, is borne out by a meta-analysis. And so this paper is obviously more recent, and it gets cited more often than any of the other individual papers. It's a winner of the Greif Research Impact Award, which is articles that are cited the most, and it's still one of the most cited Greif Award winners. So if you do know anything about entrepreneurial orientation research, you probably know that Jeff Coven and I are sort of on different sides of the fence. Jeff is actually a good friend of mine, has been since I was a doctoral student. And this is an article that we wrote together at the beginning of a special issue on entrepreneurial orientation. This paper in part expresses and reconciles some of the differences that Jeff and I have about the construct. But I put it up here because I thought I would just point out that in the introduction to this article, we make the point that at the time of the article, entrepreneurial orientation papers had a higher count than corporate entrepreneurship papers. And so even though you could argue that entrepreneurial orientation is a subset of corporate entrepreneurship, it was EO that was actually getting the citations. Notice also that we found 256 articles here. And again, I'll point that out for a number of reasons. Now, let me also say, by way of telling you that this topic is alive and well and that I'm still working on it, is that this paper right here is, is about to come out. I don't know if you can see if you can see the headline there, but this is a paper again with Jeff Coven, in which we make a case for studying entrepreneurial orientation at the individual level. This is coming out in Entrepreneurship Theory and Practice. It's truly, it was accepted about 2 weeks ago. If I had the proofs, I'd share them, but it's brand new. And here we make the argument that, look, entrepreneurial orientation has become so widespread. It's being used to study hospitals and churches and graduate students and nursing and all of these different things, that it's really just not even realistic to say that it can only be studied at the firm level. And now we make the case for why it's okay, and more than okay, but necessary, important to begin studying at the individual level of analysis. So to sort of sum up on the entrepreneurial orientation thing, it's really alive and well. There's plenty of research opportunities. And in terms of research opportunities, let me just mention one thing, and that is there's this notion of beliefs versus behaviors, or disposition versus action. And part of the difference is that Jeff Coven and I had was that our earlier work, the one I put up there, the 96 paper, sort of made a case that EO was dispositional, that it was about beliefs, that it was a mindset. Whereas Jeff has always argued that it was about behaviors and action. And so this is an interesting conundrum, because the widely used entrepreneurial orientation scale that's out there is actually one that includes both beliefs and behaviors. And scale writers, scale makers know that you're really sort of not supposed to combine beliefs and behaviors in the same scale. That's the more ideal way to put together a scale. And so the reason I mention it here is because there's actually quite a bit of interesting research questions that come from the notion of thinking about beliefs and how they relate to behaviors, rather than assuming that they are all one. In other words, does a person who has entrepreneurial orientation beliefs actually then engage in entrepreneurial orientation behaviors? And likewise, does someone who engages in entrepreneurial behaviors do so because they have an EO kind of belief, or for some other reason? Likewise, there's the notion of behaviors and as stable or disposition as personality traits. So there's a lot of topics, I think, still to be studied in the arena of entrepreneurial orientation. So on to my next topic. So long-term orientation is one of those that I have studied primarily in the context of the family business research. I still think this is an interesting topic, in part because you know, if you look back over the last 10 or 12 years, there are a lot of calls for in the research for papers on long-term orientation, on temporal matters. And so this article was written as a way to sort of be portable, even though it's written from the perspective of family firms. We see long-term orientation as something that applies beyond that to all firms. Story about this article, my friend Keith Brigham and I were at a family business conference in Cancun, and it was pouring down rain, like all day long deluge. So we went into a bar and basically outlined this paper. And it is kind of our statement paper about long-term orientation, but as it turns out, it's actually this paper that gets cited more. And it was written before this one was, but I think that the reason that this one is cited more is because, can you guess? It's because it's about entrepreneurial orientation. It compares long-term orientation and entrepreneurial orientation. And so it's just indicative of the fact that even though this sort of lays out what LTO is, this one is cited more because it's cited for its entrepreneurial orientation qualities. So now, why do I think this is interesting? Well, I think so because of this slide. I haven't shown this slide in a long time, but that's because most people, when they think of long-term orientation, they just think of futurity. They think long-term orientation means thinking about the future. Well, that's not incorrect. But, and you will find there are very good studies published in fine journals that only study futurity, and yet they call it long-term orientation. But our perspective in this paper is that a long-term orientation takes into consideration the arc of time, not just what the anticipation is about the future, but also perseverance, what needs to be done in the present to create the future, and also continuity, what we can learn from the past to inform the future. And so I think long-term orientation is sort of a more rich construct if you perceive it as having these dimensions. And I think that's also what makes it portable. That is, makes it portable to the corporate settings and to non-family settings. I think it resonates with the notion of sustainability because it's about what can we learn from the past that will inform the future. A long-term orientation has sort of the arc of time. Now, I haven't done any work in this area, but I kind of hold out for being able to return to this topic at some point in my career. My post emeritus career. So now here's an article on social entrepreneurship, and I put this up next. I mentioned it as the domain of greatest interest to me. Something I got interested in around 2007. It sort of harked back to some things that I had studied as a college student and worked on earlier in my career before I thought about getting a PhD. But I just thought I would point out a couple of things about this article. As it turns out, this is the second most cited article ever at the Strategic Entrepreneurship Journal. And yet, and it's because it was a topic that was new and people were looking for sites in good journals to cite, articles to cite. But I mention it also because review articles often don't get best paper awards. They get research impact awards. But it's not that common, even though citation count is one of the reasons for giving a best paper award. Anyway, this is one of those papers. Another one I noticed, Professor Gupta assigned you articles in which I was the third or fourth author, the 3 meta-analysis and a review piece. I'm not the number cruncher, and so I'm usually not the one who works on the meta-analysis, except as a contributor to the discussion section in the introduction. But this is another example of a review paper that's been useful, at least especially in my career. So let me use social entrepreneurship to talk about a few major research themes. And I know I'm using up my time pretty fast here. One of the themes in the social entrepreneurship research is that it's is the definition. Is it one thing? Is it a contested idea? There's also the notion of hybridity, the tensions between social goals and financial goals, how that manifests in any kind of organization, how that helps or impedes an organization from staying on track, mission drift. Then there's several theories that are very common in social entrepreneurship research these days: identity theory and social identity theory, stakeholder theory, institution theory, even paradox theory. And then at the individual level, there's research in empathy and compassion organizing. These are all theories that are important in the social entrepreneurship space. Community level research is something I'll talk about here in a minute, and that's also an important topic within social entrepreneurship. And then finally, there's the whole measurement issue. How do you really capture the idea of social value creation? It's not easily monetized. You can't usually turn it into dollars. You can in some cases, but there's a challenge there, and I think a good research challenge if that's an area of interest. I mentioned this also. I'm going to skip over this in the interest of time. I mentioned this also because one of the things I'm doing now, and my most fun teaching in any year, is the social entrepreneurship doctoral seminar. This photo was actually taken from a conference room at the University of Washington in Seattle last summer, where we teach this seminar. It's 1 week intensive, and we usually link it to either the Academy of Management or the Babson Conference. And you can see here that this summer we're linking it to both, because we thought that there might be a little pent-up demand. We had to turn down the dial on teaching this during COVID. And as it turns out, we have a full class in both Knoxville after the Babson Conference and in Boston after the Academy of Management Conference. This is a website if you care to find out a little bit more about the conference. But it's what I'm doing these days, and sort of where my career has gone now that I'm not doing other kinds of teaching. So let me just move on to civic wealth creation as sort of the last major topic I have here for you. And that is, this is sort of my current passion, my current interest. Civic wealth creation is something that emerged from, and this work, I've been working on this with Sophie Back since about 2011. It took us about 8 years to get this paper published. We sort of started looking at what is it that social entrepreneurs are trying to accomplish? What is the aim of social entrepreneurship? And we realized that it's not typically just individual level or organizational level, that what they're actually trying to do is to improve their communities. They're trying to make a difference at the level of the community, at an extra organizational level of analysis. And so civic wealth creation is this idea of what occurs when communities get together with entrepreneurs and the supporters of those communities, whether it's like philanthropic organizations or local government, to improve their well-being of their communities. And they do this by generating these different forms of wealth. And so it's not just financial wealth that they're trying to create. It's, as this bottom quote starts, it's sort of an indicator of intellectual, affective, and all sorts of resources and capacities that are developed within a community. So this model is kind of a mashup of two of the models that are in the paper. And you can see that we basically argue that communities working together with supporters of those communities, all kinds of different organizations, create enterprises, and that this together creates a value for the community. So the distinguishing features here are, as I mentioned, this sort of extra organizational civic level of analysis. And we use the term civic to express even the idea of that in a rural community in a developing country, there are still people who care about each other and who have a concern with the well-being of their community. That's the notion of civic rather than a strictly political notion of civic that we're after with this term. Obviously, we have a sort of expanded total wealth perspective, namely not wealth simply as money and material possessions, but wealth writ large, wealth as happiness and well-being, wealth as we actually have begun using capital as a proxy for wealth. So social capital, cultural capital, human capital, all of these kinds of things are how we are conceiving of wealth. Entrepreneurship is a key component. It gives legitimacy and sustainability, financial sustainability to some of these efforts. So they're not dependent on grants that, that run out or don't get renewed. There's this idea of stakeholder theory, which typically talks in terms of a focal organization and the stakeholders around it. But it also, stakeholder theory also addresses the value that's created at the intersection of diverse participants. And so by engaging beneficiaries, the community, those who are actually being helped, and also creating diverse coalitions of people to get some of these things done, then these different kinds of wealth can be created. So these are some examples from the article. I don't know if you're familiar with Mondragon, but Housing Works is basically a bookstore and a center in New York City that started during the AIDS crisis and now has become sort of a center for cultural engagement, a place where people can make money and get support and legal help with their housing needs. Water for People is actually an NGO, but it's one where they only go into communities, typically rural developing country communities. They only go in when they have buy-in across the board from the local government, the local entrepreneurs, the local teachers and parents, because many of their water and sanitation solutions are in schools. They're a model of how all of these different diverse players must come together for this to actually work. So that's civic wealth creation, again, in a very fast nutshell. And finally, my last slide is about this notion of a community level of analysis, the fourth article that you were assigned for today. So I just will say again that this is an important new topic, I think, in the Academy of Management and for new faculty to consider. When the Academy was established, the Academy of Management was established, it was intended to actually consider the societal level of analysis as one of its goals. And yet most of the research is at that sort of individual or group or organizational level. And so it's only recently that people have turned their attention to the community level of analysis. Once again, a president of the Academy, Marianne Glenn, a few years ago in her presidential speech said, we need to start looking at community again. And it's where a lot of things take place, including entrepreneurial things. So 2 articles to share with you. This article is one where, among other things, we make the case that capital can be a proxy for studying wealth at the community level. But then here's the one that you were assigned to read. And I think this is a good one in terms of current research. I mean, it just came out for one thing, but it's also the case that people have thrown the term community into research for a lot of years without giving it any kind of precise definition. And what this paper did was, by looking at both the types of communities and the role of community, it was able to actually say, by considering what the sort of precise engagement of a community is, we can draw some more conclusions and use it. So it's a paper that sort of raises a lot of research questions, but also provides some, good fuel, good insights to do more research in community. I'm trying to flip through my notes and make sure I said everything. So I think that's about it. I did want to add that to write this paper, we had to go to a lot of literatures. The reviewers first pushed back the fact that we'd only use business school literature. We had to get into the political science literature, the geography literature, the economic and community development literature in order to write this article. So it's got a lot of references in it. So anyway, I've sort of blazed through this. I've gone over my time, but I wanted to try and, as Professor Gupta asked, cover sort of what I've been working on, what I think is still interesting, and sort of the background that got me here. If there's anything that you want me to clarify about what I've said, or if there's other things you want to ask me, I'm happy to participate in this for a while. And I think with that, I'll stop sharing screen. Does that sound right, Vishal?
Yeah, thanks, Tom. We already have several students who have questions. So let me invite Lucy to ask the first question.
And thank you so much. The community level analysis is super interesting. Like I have a question about junior scholars who study in adjacent disciplines. For example, I got my PhD from Ohio State in business geography, and my study is entrepreneurship within the community level, but I haven't learned the mainstream entrepreneurship literature from, like you mentioned, strategy from business school. So do you have any suggestions to younger scholars like me just enter this field but want to speak to the mainstream entrepreneurship scholar, taking advantage of this trend, that I want to bring something that we already learned, but I still want to speak to the mainstream entrepreneurship research community. So do you have some suggestions for us?
Sure, thanks. That's a good question. And first of all, I would keep an eye out for what I would call special issues that are addressing the community area. And I think you'll find that there's more and more work in this area. So there's opportunities not only to read in special issues, but perhaps also to submit. Some advice I got early on that you might think of is when you're writing an article, ask yourself, who are the 5 people that you want to read this article, right? It's kind of like, what conversation do you want to enter into? And so there are actually a couple of scholars come to mind who are in this conversation. I think I told you that we had to expand our list of journals to write that article. Well, when we did that, we asked ourselves, well, who should we reach out to? And so the people that come to mind are Brett Gilbert and Larry Plummer. These are both folks who are working in this kind of geography plus entrepreneurship space. And so I would say, look at their work and see if you can get into a conversation with them, because I think that they, if you want to write to this mainstream area, there's a very good chance that they are the ones who will read your paper, or they may be your 5 people. And so I would say that's a good way to approach this. Is you seem to be clear about what conversation you want to get in. So next thing to do is to find out who's in that conversation and to create some relationships with them.
Very helpful. Thank you so much.
Next question, Julia.
Hi, Tom. Just wanted to let you know I will participate in your social entrepreneurship seminar in August at Harvard Public School. So, yeah, so I'm looking forward to that. And to apply for the seminar, I read your article and with Sophia about civic wealth creation. I like it a lot because I was trained in sociology. I was teaching social problems before transition to business school. And recently I read an article about, the title is Capabilities and Strategic Entrepreneurship in Public Organizations by Peter Klein and Joe Mahoney. And the main argument is that public entrepreneurship could do both social good and bad. I like this article a lot as well. So my question is related to Lucy, is that as a junior faculty, because we both know that if you want to publish a paper, your audience is very important. So as a junior faculty, do we need to try to integrate both two approaches? Because to me, in my understanding, these two articles, this article and your article, actually are looking at the same phenomena, but using different terms and different approaches. So is it wise for junior faculty to try to integrate both approaches, or we just wanted to, or we just needed to focus one and have a deep conversation with just one approach?
You know, there's a lot of ways to answer that question. I mean, I think for one thing, you have to think about I'm assuming that you're on a path to tenure, you know, and so one of the things you need to think about is you know, what articles will enable you to get published so that you have sufficient you know, publications to get tenure. And so you have to be careful in that respect. And I don't think so, you know, I think that either one of those paths, either one of those article paths would be okay, but it may also be that there's an opportunity to integrate them, and that the integration itself is the interesting topic. And so you might not want to try that by yourself. You might want to put together a team or work with others to do that. But I mean, I'm not sure. I don't think there's enough yet to do a review piece. Maybe there is. You know, when I think about articles on sort of entrepreneurship and the public good, entrepreneurship and you know, and the common entrepreneurship for the good, I think there's actually more and more of that. And so maybe have a look at whether or not there's enough research to do a review piece, because, you know, it may be. I mean, I put up the social entrepreneurship article that we did. When we first submitted that article, one of the reviewers wrote back and said, there's not enough research to do this paper. There's not enough been written to actually have this paper yet. You need to wait a while. And so what we found was that's another case where we actually went into this other literature. We went into the nonprofit literature, and we went into beyond this kind of business school set of journals in order to find additional articles. And when we resubmitted, we had a much more sort of breadth. So, you know, I think that the question of whether or not to focus on integrating those or focus on one or the other may be a function of other things, like what's your data? What data do you have? What co-authors do you have to work with? Because it may be that maybe you go to conferences this summer and you meet a lot of civic wealth creation people, you know, and that becomes an opportunity for you. Or maybe the opposite, you meet a lot of sort of capabilities and public good people, and that becomes an opportunity for you. So I don't think that you should stay away from trying to integrate them or feel like you have to choose one or the other. I think you should see what opportunities develop, and also, of course, ask yourself, you know, what is of most interest. If integrating them is of most interest, and that's where your passion is, then that's a good reason to go there.
Thanks. Starting with data and systematic review. That's the new term. That's a term I recently learned, and the methodology I recently learned. It's a good strategy. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Lucia, do you want to go next?
Yes, yes, please. Thank you, Professor Lumpkin. I am excited about this paper that you mentioned, the one that is coming regarding entrepreneurial orientation at the individual level. And I would like to ask you, when you were building this paper, does it came to your attention the model of entrepreneurial mindset proposed by Professor Curatko, in which he proposes this triad about the cognitive aspect, the behavioral aspect, and the emotional aspect of the entrepreneur, and how, in case it is there's a relationship or an interaction between this individual level of entrepreneurial orientation that you are proposing in your new paper and this approach from Professor Kuratko?
Well, I think certainly there's a behavioral aspect to entrepreneurial orientation, and you could make a case that there's a cognitive aspect to entrepreneurial orientation. So, I mean, I think you could integrate elements of that into Professor Kuratko's approach. You know, I have to give a plug for a paper we just wrote a mindset paper that's entrepreneurial orientation based. And so it basically integrates beliefs on the one hand with behaviors on the other hand in a model that's got its roots in entrepreneurial orientation. I'll be glad to send that to you if you like. The first author is Rob Pittick, and it's in a Journal of Small Business Management. It came out last year. But I do think that when you think about the and by the way, we cited Kuratko's paper in that a number of times. We use that as a leaping off point, the Kuratko paper. And so I do think that there's a way, you know, I think the less developed part of EO is EO behaviors, frankly. EO, I think, is more kind of, you know, our managers have a tendency to believe this way, or you know, we have a preponderance of risk-taking behaviors or not, you know. And so I think that there's a lot of opportunity to develop in one of these areas, because I think that, you know, mindset is only meaningful to the extent that it then results in behaviors. And so I think that that's kind of the way to look at that. And I think that an EO can, again, we wrote this in our paper. EO certainly is part of a mindset, and the question then becomes, how does it inform behaviors? And I think that you can, you know, that you can use Kuratko's framework and entrepreneurial orientation. I'm thinking if I gave it more thought, I might give you a better answer. I haven't really given that one much thought, but I do think that there'll be some things in this individual level paper that will help you think this through.
That would be great, Professor, if you could share me that other paper. And thank you so much for your
Yeah,
talk.
I can. I'll be glad. I can perhaps send it to Vishal, and he can share it, or I'm glad to receive your emails at lumpkin@utk.edu. Sure.
Yeah, Lucia, I'll give you
Thank
Dr. Lumpkin's email so you can reach out directly to him. But we'll move on to the next question. Anuradha, do you want to ask your question on Canva?
Yes, Professor. So, hello, Professor. Glad to be a part of this conversation. I just wanted your views on one of the constructs I've been studying as a part of age and the affinity of a person to be entrepreneurial. I wanted to study time perspective. So I just want your views regarding what is the role of time perspective as far as entrepreneurial orientation is concerned. Because of the papers I have read, time perspective is just a small part of the paper, or mostly it is in psychology-based paper. Maybe I have not read all the literature so far. But so I just wanted to get your views and thoughts on this. Like, is it a good idea to integrate time perspective in entrepreneurial orientation? How do a person think about as per his age? What time does he have, and how does he or she decide whether to go into entrepreneurship or not, how oriented that person is? So something regarding that, if you could just give your views.
So let me, I'll just say a couple of things about this. I mean, we get into that a little bit in the two long-term orientation articles I put up. So, you know, in fact, the propositions that are in the LTO and EO paper are, you know, some that are positively related to long-term orientation, some are negatively related to long-term orientation. So that'll give you some ideas about how EO may or may not work well with time. But I think that there's two ways to think about time in this conversation. And one of them is just calendar time, the passage of time, you know, the marching by of the years. I think that's not a good way to go. I mean, even though we defined long-term orientation in terms of thinking about things that happen, you know, more than 5 years from now. I think even that is not as important as thinking about how does a person individually experience time. And so one of the slides that I used to use when I presented the LTO paper, the head thing was, how long is long, right? And so that's kind of the question. If you are a nascent entrepreneur and you've just, just borrowed some money, or maybe your grandmother gave you some money and they're expecting you to start a business and you're trying to get it off the ground, 3 months, 4 months, 1 year seems like an eternity, right? But if you're a family business, maybe the second or third generation, and you're trying to make decisions about that will affect your grandchildren, right? Then time is a really long, stretched out thing. And so, you have to think about time in terms of the perspective of the individual or of the dominant coalition, say, in the case of a family business, and in terms of other kinds of constraints. And so it's not so much calendar time as it is the perception of time relative to the project that you're engaged in. And I think that that's the way to think about time, especially as it relates to entrepreneurial orientation. We think of innovativeness and risk-taking as sort of, risk-taking is sort of, in the now. Innovation is sort of like, you're trying to find out, make a new discovery, and yet sometimes it takes long. In fact, we did a paper, I'll just say one more thing before the next question. A paper that I wrote on long-term orientation and family business makes the case that family businesses are better innovators because they have a long-term perspective, right? They're not in a hurry to innovate, worried about the next quarterly returns and the financial reports. They're generationally thinking, so they can take a deeper dive into developing a new business idea because they've got the long-term in mind. And so those are the kind of considerations I would think about in trying to integrate time into a study.
Okay, thank you, Professor.
Okay. I think
Sunny, do you want to go next?
Yeah. Hello, Dr. Lumpkin and Dr. Gupta. I have two of you. As I cited, Dr. Lumpkin as the EO on my dissertation, and Dr. Gupta is the resources. So both of you was on my dissertation. Now I'm seeing you both. It's really exciting. But thank you so much. Basically, my question is, the social entrepreneurship and entrepreneur ecosystem have a lot of things in common. So my question is, what is your opinion about that? The way I see is that there's actually two sides of the same coins, because the entrepreneur ecosystem they actually look at the benefit of entrepreneurs. In the social entrepreneurship, they must look at from the social perspective. So based on the graph that you presented today, it's like three circles: is community, enterprise, and supports. This graph is similar to what I see on the entrepreneur ecosystem, which is like the 6 components. So I hope, so I want to see if you have any, perspective about that. What's the similarity? What's the difference, and why we have to? Because the two of them are emerging and actually pursuing two trends. So I want to see at some point they actually come across, or they continue to go like parallel. Right?
So let me answer in this way. So first of all, I would think of the ecosystem as more as context. And I think that the framework model that we put up is sort of like an ecosystem. In fact, there's a new social entrepreneurship textbook out, and they defined social entrepreneurship using the civic wealth creation model. And instead of supporters in that model, they put ecosystem, right? And so they argue that the ecosystem is sort of all of the players, the whether it's the local government officials or, local philanthropists, the community foundation, maybe it's wealthy individuals or a university, all of these players, they define that as the ecosystem. And so the ecosystem is sort of the context where this happens. Whereas social entrepreneurship, I think of social entrepreneurship as the activities, as the efforts that are being made. My co-author and I, so this is also Sophie Back, we have a paper that's got a 3-word kind of definition of social entrepreneurship that we've been trying to get published for a long time now. We've presented it at like 3 or 4 conferences and presented it into MBA student classes, but it hasn't been published yet. And that is social entrepreneurship as pro-social economic empowerment. Pro-social economic empowerment as a kind of a shorthand way to think about what social entrepreneurship is. And so the point is, pro-social economic empowerment is an activity that people engage in to try and improve their communities and make things better. And where does that happen? It happens in an ecosystem. So that's how I see the difference.
Thank you.
Sure.
Avis, do you want to go next?
Yep. Hello. Hello to everyone. Thank you, Professor Lumpkin, for sharing your thoughts and your career path in the beginning. Being inspired from your paper, actually, that you try to compare and find out the relationship between the entrepreneur's age and the career, and you find out the U-shape. You told us that you were not into the meta-analytic part initially. I would like to ask regarding the time. So time-wise, what would be your suggestion in terms of how much do we need to dedicate ourselves into a particular topic or a research? For example, how much time did it take you to find this relationship and the U-shape? Or how can we decide how much we should invest on?
Yeah, this is a good question, and I know it's a very important question for junior scholars. My first answer is you have to find out what you're good at and what you love to work on. So the specific question you asked, I cannot answer because I didn't do it and I wasn't involved. All right. I was involved in telling the story that underlies that meta-analysis, writing up the results, trying to contextualize them. And so if you look at my work has always been more conceptual than it has empirical. That's where I've made my contributions. That's where I've gotten, recognition. And so that's what I love to do. I love to sort of write conceptual papers and theory papers. And I'm not in, I know some techniques, a few statistical techniques, but it's not what I'm good at. And so, if you love to do meta-analysis, my friend Hao Zhao has a remarkable career, in part because of how well he does meta-analysis, and he knows how to do them, and he loves to do that. And then he finds co-authors like me to help him, tell the story that's surrounding them. And so even though I'm an author on some meta-analysis, I'm always at least the 3rd or 4th author because I'm just writing it up. And that's because that's the part that I like to do. So it may be that, my former student and now good friend, David Gross, he loves databases and he loves to work with databases, and he loves to find them, to clean them up, and to see what they can be used for. And he does that, and he writes papers with people who then, help him make good use of the databases. So my advice to you is to find out what you're passionate about and focus on that. There's a good chance that I can say this with almost 100% certainty, you will need to demonstrate that you can write empirical papers in order to get tenure. You can't just write conceptual papers to get you to tenure, I don't think. There's maybe a few exceptions, but that's, we're in the business to go out and collect data, to study organizations, and to interpret that data empirically. And so you need to be able to do that. And I would advise all of you to keep fresh on your empirical skills throughout your career. Because I had a colleague who was a full professor. This was way back when, and when STEM analysis became popular, she took a full semester course in this just so she could continue to publish and be using the latest statistical techniques. So this is really important for your career. But you get to where I am, and I can afford to just do conceptual stuff, and that's pretty much all I do at this point. So find out what you're passionate about, get good at a few things, and do that over and over, at least until you get tenure.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Monique, do you want to go next?
Sure. Thank you, Dr. Gupta and Dr. Lumpkin, for your feedback on entrepreneurship. And Dr. Lumpkin, my question for you was actually typed in the chat, but just to rephrase, so we're talking about entrepreneurship orientation and the different components, innovativeness, competitive advantage, risk-taking, et cetera, characteristics of entrepreneurship. My PhD is in business management with an emphasis of strategy and innovation, and my specific interest is entrepreneurship and innovation. And so what I was asking in the chat was basically kind of your theory on the socio-demographic component of entrepreneurship and any advantages or challenges that you've read in the research that socio-demographic subgroups face on the journey to social entrepreneurship or entrepreneurship in general. And then if you've not found any specific identification in this regard, what is your theory on that?
So when you say socio-demographic, you're talking about age, race, gender, these kinds of socio-demographics?
Yes, exactly. And more specifically, race. I know we've read about gender in the literature and we've read about age in the literature. I know there's still more research to do there, but specifically race.
Well, I think it's an interesting topic. I think that there is opportunity there. I think that how social entrepreneurship is approached is very likely to be different as a result of that. So one of the books, one of the things that I'm working on with Sophie Back is more work on civic wealth creation. And we have been studying this organization called the Boston Ujima Project. And it's basically a minority diversity community within Boston that has sort of gathered up its forces and gathered up its resources in order to build the strength of the community among people who don't have the same sort of access to resources and the same, frankly, privilege in terms of accessing resources. And so part of the reason that it's an interesting story to us is because they're using their cultural capital and their political capital and their social capital in order to create a kind of regime, if you will, that makes it possible for them to access financial capital, right? If that makes sense. So I think that what you'll find is that the motivations, the access to resources, I think there could be interesting differences, significant differences there. And the one thing I would suggest to you, I found this to be the case in family business. Let me just say something about that. So when I got into family business research, one of the things that we found was that there's an awful lot of studies that compared families to non-families, family businesses to non-family businesses. That was sort of the most common kind of research that you saw get published. But one of the things I did was I sort of brought EO into family business research. And then the conversation shifted at least a little bit in my little corner of things. It shifted from entrepreneurial family businesses to non-entrepreneurial family businesses. In other words, it was all family. It wasn't family versus non-family. So I think that rather than think in terms of one race versus another race, maybe the thing to do is to think of socially oriented African Americans, I'll make an assumption, versus non-socially oriented African Americans, and to see whether or not there's something within a race that those differences, I think, might actually make make for some interesting research. And so I think there are opportunities there. I would tell you, based on my experience, that there are folks that have worked only on gender, and this is, people I know from the past that have worked only on gender, and it's been a little challenging for them to ultimately get tenure. You need to have maybe some breadth outside of just a particular socio-demographic group in terms of the kind of research you do. So I would say socio-demographic in general, I think that would be fine, but something that's too narrow within that might not give you the breadth that you need to have a robust research record.
So Tom, we had asked you for 40 minutes of your time, and we are already past the 60-minute mark. So we have several students who still have questions, but I don't want to take up more of your time.
I have more time. I can go a little longer if.
Okay, so we'll take, I guess, a couple questions more. Lucy, do you want to go next?
Oh, thank you. I want to follow up with the community level of entrepreneurship. Just now you mentioned that long-term orientation in the family business domain. Is it a good idea to start with, like you just mentioned, that long-term orientation in the community level is called sustainability. So is it a good idea to start from the long-term orientation within family business literature and apply that into the community level and focus on some phenomena? Some parts can be explained, some parts cannot be explained. And I focus on the parts that cannot be explained, and then borrow theories from, for example, community geography, business geography, those places I'm familiar with, and then to let the chemistry reaction happen. It's not just a physical reaction, but a chemistry reaction happen to give birth something new and give birth to the new theory, which speak to the mainstream entrepreneurship literature. Do you think that's a good strategy for very young junior scholars trained from adjacent disciplines of entrepreneurship? That is, begin from mature theory, for example, at the family level, family entrepreneurship, long-term orientation, and then apply to the community level, but focus on the parts that cannot be explained by the business mature existing theory, and then borrow adjacent theories. Do you think that's a good strategy?
Yes, I do. I think that is, and just kind of in general, the way that you said it there at the end, I think that's right. So I was just, I guess last month in Knoxville, participating at the University of Tennessee, participating in the Academy of Management Review Idea Development Workshop with Sherry Thatcher and some other great scholars. And basically she described, how do you get a theory paper, in AMR? And one of the things was kind of what you just said, namely the idea that you have a theory that, is typically kind of used to explain a certain sort of domain of activity, but you're able to export it to another domain of activity. And this is, and it helps to explain that, and maybe in the process also informs back the theory in some way. I think that is a kind of a good way. And then the specific thing that you mentioned about the idea of LTO in communities, I love that idea. I hadn't thought of it before, but I think that, there's probably some assumptions that we make about communities, namely that we think that they are for the long term, that they're just there and they exist. And that may be true with certain kinds of communities, but not true with other kinds of communities. So for example, one of the communities that we account for in our paper are these virtual communities, like, Linux software development communities, that kind of, so do they have the same kind of long-term orientation as a geographical community? I think these are all kinds of interesting ideas. What is the temporal orientation of a community, and what are the implications of that? I think is kind of an interesting research question.
Great. So not just physical communities, but virtual communities. That is exactly what I did. Like because geographies, we don't just study like physical space, but we study virtual space as well.
Right. Good.
Thank you so
Wonderful.
much.
Mandy, do you want to ask the next question? Mandy, you are on mute.
Okay, thanks for your reminder. Thanks, Tom, for your very insightful question. I'm a second-year PhD student at Indiana University, also working with Sophie a little bit. So I guess still nowadays, my question is, I'm not 100% clear about the difference with community versus ecosystem literature. Are they like two standalone distinct conversations, or they are just like same term, like same concept, but different terms?
Well, yes, I don't think they're the same concept. I really don't think they're the same concept. I think ecosystem is still not well defined. That would be my, but I haven't looked at that literature as hard as some of you all have. There's 3 or 4, at least 2 or 3 people who've mentioned ecosystems. Maybe you all should get together and write a review about ecosystems. To me, it's still used in very different ways, depending on who you're talking to. Some people refer to it in a way that's similar to community. That is, it's just kind of the surroundings, right? It's like the businesses that are there and the money that's there and, the entrepreneurial experience that's there, in an area, right? And so that's one of the things that you hear with ecosystem, but it's also refers to, has more of a dynamics quality to it in the way that it's defined as well, in terms of, what's the action within the ecosystem that, like what are the spillover effects, and how does that affect the things that go on there? So I'm not convinced that that they are the same thing. Having said that, let me mention one thing. If you read the community paper that you were sent, you'll notice that in the literature, it wasn't it 87, something like that. That very large percentage of the communities that are discussed in the community literature are geographical communities. So, by a long margin, the community literature is mostly about geographical communities. And so I think if you start talking about, virtual communities and Linux software developer kind of communities, yeah, that sounds more like ecosystem, right? But if you're talking about, the community in those examples that I gave you, like Housing Works in New York City, or Water for People working in South America or India, they are not really ecosystems in the same sense at all. So I think that's one way to distinguish between them.
Okay, and I have another more general question. For example, I'm at a stage doing my comprehensive exam, starting my dissertation. How do we really identify the conversation or the scholar identity we want to have? Like, how do you pinpoint down this is the research topic or the literature I want to engage in? Because another thing is, a paper gets published doesn't mean that paper gets cited a lot. How do you narrow down your research interests at the same time a promising growing literature to start your research and a scholarly journey? Do you have any tips on that?
Well, so my first tip is, don't worry about that too much until after you get through comps.
True.
Okay, so that's my first tip. But secondly, I just feel like you really have to be led by what you care about and by what you're interested in, what you have some passion around. It may be that that you won't be interested in a topic that gets a lot of citations, or that is everybody in the world wants to read. It may be that it's something that's more niche than that, and that's okay. I think the thing to do is to endeavor to have some impact in some little world, in some conversation, and that's the people that you want to hang out with and visit with at conferences, and that's the way to think about it. Because I know Vishal and I have been to these kinds of things our whole career, and someone always wants to know, well, what's the hottest topic and what should we study? It's just not possible to really answer that in any kind of way that you know, is lasting. And so, you know, I might give you an answer that was like really good for the next 3 years and then kind of drop off the map. I think that, you know, the thing that needs to drive you is what you're most curious about and what you care about.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tom. And I promise Oscar's question will be the last. I certainly want to not extend this anymore. So Oscar, last question.
Thank you, Professor Gupta. Hi, Professor Lumpkin. Thank you for the presentation, very enriching and stimulating. My question, I have 2 questions that are very short, but because it gives me some confusions. So you mentioned that there is a field of opportunities in making research in entrepreneurial orientation in an individual level. So my question is, what is the main difference that you have with the personalities and that you mentioned in your other articles with the big 5? Or how you see the main difference between this type of research with EO in individual level? And my second question is more regarding with the long-term orientation presentation that you did, in terms of, do you think that this is in some way antagonic with, or that with some other behaviors in entrepreneurship research, like for example, effectuation, that is more related to short terms and not avoiding planification? So what are your thoughts on that?
So first of all, I think that it's true that, you know, the article that you were given to read, I think one of the most distant ones in terms of my memory, about personality, the big 5 and the dimensions of EO. I think that, you know, for me, the personality stuff sort of all precedes the beliefs that flow, the beliefs that you have about, to me, this idea of entrepreneurial orientation is this combination of the beliefs that you have about entrepreneurship and the actions you take as a result of that. And so, you know, in my mind, the personality is all antecedent to that. And the personality sort of interacts with life experiences to create the beliefs, right? And then those are the entrepreneurial orientation beliefs. And so to me, one is antecedent to the other. That's my sense. You know, I'm not sure others would agree with me. I'm not sure how Zhao would agree with me, or Scott Siebert, my co-authors, but I think that's how I see it. We talk about that, by the way, a little bit in this entrepreneurial orientation based mindset paper that I mentioned. But in terms of long-term orientation, I should have written this down. Oh, how does it relate to other things like effectuation? And yeah, so effectuation is arguably, you know, very much in the moment and completely non-planful. And I think that's a reasonable assumption to make about effectuation. Now, it may have, you know, if you think about effectuation as, you know, how do I make a meal with the supplies I have, you know, there may be a long-term component to the fact that your cupboards are full of certain supplies already, right? But in general, the act is very much in the now and in the present. And so long-term orientation does imply planfulness, but it doesn't necessarily mean that a decision that you make in the moment isn't a momentary decision. I don't know if I'm saying that very well. It just seems to me that to go back to my metaphor, long-term orientation is sort of where you how you perceive the arc of time. That is, to the extent to which in any kind of decision process that you're engaged in, you have in consideration both the past and the future, as well as what you have to decide in the present. So one of the things, for example, long-term orientation, you may be saving, your organization may be saving up money to make an investment in equipment or facilities. And all of a sudden you have an opportunity that's presented to you to buy something that you weren't expecting to be able to buy. And the only way to buy it is to use up those monies that you were planning to use for something else, right? If you make the decision to make that purchase, that doesn't mean that you don't have a long-term orientation. It simply means that you've evaluated the options strategically, and you've made the decision that this will give you a greater advantage than the other thing that you were planning. And so, I think that that's the way you need to think about long-term orientation. It is the idea that you have some sensibility about what the consequences of your actions are, that they're informed by what actions that you've taken in the past, but that, all we have is the present. And so, I think if you can think about long-term orientation that way, then it doesn't conflict with bricolage or effectuation or these kinds of like in the moment kind of things, because even the bricoleur, for example, must know, that a thing that they've made from, that they've put together in the past has taught them what will work, in the present. And so to me, that they're not in conflict. It's just one has a longer sort of time horizon than the other.
Thank you, Professor.
On that note, let me thank Professor Lumpkin for his generous time today and his insights on research and how to build a career. So thank you, Dr. Lumpkin.
Very glad to be here. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you. And hopefully I'll get to see you in Boston and ask you several questions that I have.
Okay, great. Well, and I see some other names and faces of people that are going to be in the seminar this summer. And so, hi, Marieska. And so I'm looking forward to that as well. So perhaps I'll see all of you, any of you, at either Babson or Academy.
Bye-bye.
Okay, bye. Thanks.